baby wasn't supposed to be there, not between a litter of German Shepherd puppies, not under the belly of a dog that had never seen a child in its life. But there it was, tiny, warm, suckling alongside the others like it belonged. When Hank first laid eyes on the scene inside the hollowed tree, something inside him cracked open. He'd seen strange things in his years, but nothing like this. A dog giving shelter to a human infant. That wasn't natural. That was something else, something bigger. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments, and if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you? Please give this video a like and consider subscribing. Bitterroot Ridge was cloaked in silence, save for the occasional creaking of pine trees bending under the weight of melting snow. It was late March in rural Montana, a season suspended between winter's stubborn end and spring's timid arrival. The sky was leaden, soaked with the memory of the previous night's storm, and the ground was slick with mud and broken twigs. The wind still whistled down the ravines, but its fury had passed. Morning had come, but it felt like the land was still holding its breath. Hank Miller stepped out onto the wooden porch of his weather-beaten farmhouse, his eyes scanning the horizon. 58 years old. Hank was a man carved from solitude, a former Marine. He carried himself with the steady silence of someone who had seen too much and spoken too little, tall and lean, with silver-streaked hair kept short beneath a faded cap. His face was marked by deep creases, not all from age, but from years of watching the world retreat from him after his wife died. He rarely smiled and never ventured beyond the town limits unless absolutely necessary. People in nearby Hamilton whispered about him. Hank's heart died with Mary, but one constant remained in his life. Shepherd. Shepherd was a 6-year-old German Shepherd with a thick gray and black coat, alert amber eyes, and the instincts of a born guardian. He had been trained once. Hank never said where or why, but it was clear the dog understood more than most people did. Protective, yet gentle. Shepherd had saved Hank's sanity in the years after Mary's accident. They were never apart. Until now. It had been a rough night. The storm had ripped through the valley with ferocity, thunder shaking the walls and wind howling like wolves in mourning. Shepherd had been restless, pacing near the back door, ears pricked toward the forest, and then he was gone, vanished into the storm. Hank had called for him until his throat ached, but no paw steps returned. Now, in the gray quiet of dawn, Hank set out with his coat zipped high and his boots heavy with mud. The forest loomed in front of him like a cathedral of sorrow. But Shepherd was out there. Hank knew it. The trail wasn't hard to follow. Shepherd had left deep paw prints along the eastern slope of the ridge, winding past the old orchard and into the timberline. Hank moved methodically, scanning the ground, brushing aside low branches. He didn't think about why Shepherd had left, just that he needed to be found. Half an hour in, something shifted. The usual stillness of the woods was pierced by a strange quiet, too quiet. Hank's instincts bristled. Up ahead, tucked beneath a low bluff of boulders and rotted tree trunks, was a hollow, a natural pocket carved by time and erosion. It was dark inside, but something flickered at the edge of his vision. Movement, a shape. Shepherd. Hank called low. The dog lifted his head slowly. His ears twitched, but he didn't come. Hank stepped closer and saw why. Shepherd was lying curled around a nest of bodies, newborn puppies, squirming and squeaking in the straw-covered floor of the hollow. But Hank's breath caught as he counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, and one more. Not a puppy, a baby, an actual human baby. The infant was pale pink, no larger than a loaf of bread, its tiny fists balled up against its chest. It lay nestled between the pups, wrapped only in a fraying piece of cloth. Its skin slick with birth but clearly alive, breathing, warm, even suckling gently at Shepard's flank alongside the pups. Hank staggered back, his stomach flipping. His mind raced through questions, none of which had answers. How, why, who Shepard watched him, calm but unyielding, eyes flickering between Hank and the baby as if to say, I know this doesn't make sense, but here we are. A few miles away, in the yellow farmhouse at the edge of the valley, another story was unfolding. Toby Willis, a quiet 8-year-old boy with curly brown hair and wide green eyes, sat cross-legged in his bedroom. His small hands moved rhythmically across paper with a blue crayon. His room was filled with drawings, dogs, trees, stars, but always Shepard. He loved that dog more than any toy or person, though he never said so. Toby was autistic and rarely spoke, but he saw the world differently, sometimes eerily so. This morning, he'd drawn something new. Shepard curled around a glowing child with wings. His mother, Carol, glanced at the drawing and shivered, back in the forest. Hank knelt down slowly, the chill of the ground seeping through his jeans. He reached out toward the baby, fingers trembling, and Shepard didn't flinch. Instead, he shifted slightly to give Hank room. Gently. Hank picked up the child. It let out a soft whimper and then settled, as if even this unfamiliar touch offered comfort. Hank cradled the baby against his chest and looked at Shepard, who was licking one of the pups. Something in Hank's chest tightened, not fear, not shock, but awe, reverence. Shepard had not just found the baby, he had cared for it, protected it. Hank stood, baby swaddled in his arms, and whispered, "Let's get you all home." And Shepard, ever the guardian, rose silently and followed. Chapter 2. The Mother in the Shadows. Night draped itself over Bitterroot Ridge like a heavy quilt, stitched with pine silhouettes and the hush of distant wind. The old farmhouse sat quietly under the darkening sky, its windows casting weak yellow halos onto the porch. Inside, the wood stove hummed softly as Hank Miller sat at the kitchen table, staring at the infant bundled in a blanket-lined crate beside him. Shepard lay nearby, his eyes half closed but his ears sharply alert, ever watchful. The pups were tucked into a basket under the stairs, their rhythmic squeaks the only sound besides the occasional crackle from the stove. The child, a boy, Hank had confirmed, was impossibly calm. He slept with a serenity that unnerved Hank, as if the child knew something he didn't. Hank had bottle-fed him with goat's milk, warmed gently on the stove, and improvised a rubber nipple from an old hunting thermos cap. The boy had taken it without protest, eyes never opening, as though content in this strange arrangement. It had only been 12 hours, but it already felt as if everything Hank thought he understood about the world had been quietly rewritten. And yet, something gnawed at him. Shepard had growled, not at Hank, but at the shadows beyond the barn earlier that afternoon, not once, but twice. Once as Hank brought the pups in, and again just before sunset, when he stepped onto the porch to collect firewood. Each time, the dog had stiffened, his eyes narrowing toward the edge of the tree line as though something or someone was out there, watching, now. With night deepening, Hank felt it too, a stillness in the woods that wasn't right, an absence of sound that spoke louder than noise. Hank stood, adjusted his flannel, and moved to the window overlooking the barnyard. The moon, barely a sliver, cast pale lines across the frozen grass. Shepherd rose beside him, his ears pricking forward. Hank opened the door and stepped into the cold. He made his way around the barn, his boots crunching over frost-kissed earth. He wasn't expecting anything, he never was, but his gut told him to look. As he rounded the corner near the old feed shed, his flashlight caught movement, a flicker. Barely there, he froze. Shepherd bristled beside him, low and silent, behind a stack of broken crates. Someone moved. "Who's there?" Hank called, voice low but firm. A pause. Then, from the shadows, a voice answered. Fragile. Dry as cracked leaves. "Don't hurt me." Hank stepped forward slowly, his flashlight revealing the figure of a young woman crouched against the barn wall. She was thin, soaked in mud, with tangled hair the color of corn husks and eyes wide with terror. Her clothes, what remained of them, were torn and clinging to her in patches of dirt and blood. Her hands trembled as she tried to stand, but her legs betrayed her. Hank's voice softened. "I won't. But I need to know who you are." "I'm Maggie," she whispered. Maggie Callahan. She looked no older than 25, though hardship had weathered her features into something older. Her cheekbones were sharp, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion and something deeper. Shame. Perhaps she was barefoot, one sock hanging loose from her ankle. Her breathing was shallow, as if every inhale was a battle. Hank took off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders without a word. She flinched, but didn't resist. "Were you the one who left the baby with Shepherd?" he asked gently. Maggie's eyes filled with tears. "I had no choice," she said, voice cracking. I gave birth in the woods. I couldn't go back to town. He would have found me, my boyfriend." She answered, "Chase, he said if I kept the baby, he'd kill us both." Hank's jaw clenched. He didn't ask for details. He didn't need to. He'd heard this kind of fear before, in war zones and women's shelters alike. It spoke a universal language. "How long were you out there?" "Since yesterday morning," she said. "I hid during the storm. Found the hollow where your dog was. I thought he might help." Hank turned to Shepherd, whose eyes now locked onto Maggie, not with suspicion, but with something close to recognition, as if he'd known all along. "You're coming inside," Hank said. Maggie blinked. "Why?" "Because it's 29 degrees out here, and you just had a baby in the woods. That's why." She looked as though she might protest, but then nodded, too weak to argue. Hank helped her up and led her slowly toward the house, Shepherd flanking them like a sentinel. Inside. The baby stirred at the sound of the door. Maggie froze when she saw him, her arms folding across her chest in an instinctive, invisible cradle. She stared at him for a long moment, and then the dam broke. Her knees gave out. Hank caught her before she hit the floor. "It's okay," he said quietly. "He's safe." Maggie was still crying as he helped her to the couch. Shepherd lay at her feet, his head on his paws, watching silently. The next morning, a thin line of sun stretched over the distant ridge, thawing the frost, one glittering blade of grass at a time. Maggie slept fitfully in the spare bedroom. Hank had cleaned her up and given her fresh clothes, his late wife's, stored in a cedar trunk upstairs. He hadn't opened it in years. He didn't sleep. Instead, he stood at the porch with Shepherd, a thermos of coffee in hand. The woods seemed normal again. Or maybe he'd just adjusted to the new kind of chaos. From across the valley, a familiar figure appeared on the hill, small, slow-moving, with a backpack too big for his narrow shoulders. "Toby." The boy reached the fence, looked toward the porch, then sat down in the grass without saying a word. In his hands, a sketch pad. Hank watched silently. 20 minutes passed. Then Toby stood, left the sketch pad on the fence post, and walked away. Hank retrieved it. The drawing on the first page made him pause. It was him and Maggie, standing side by side under the barn's shadow. Shepherd curled protectively in front of them. The baby, this time, had no wings, but he glowed. Hank exhaled slowly and walked back inside. The days that followed were thick with quiet tension, like a rope stretched too tightly between two trees in the wind. Maggie had stayed at the farmhouse, her presence slowly knitting itself into the fabric of daily life. She moved carefully through Hank's world, as if afraid to leave too many footprints, and yet those very footsteps began to fill the emptiness that had echoed through the halls since Mary's death. She wore Hank's late wife's old flannel shirts, too big for her slender frame, and spent her mornings folding laundry, feeding the goats, and helping with small repairs around the barn. She never complained. She never asked to leave. But the fear still lingered behind her soft blue eyes like a bruise that wouldn't fade. Hank noticed the change in the house before he admitted it out loud. The rooms no longer felt like storage for the past. The kitchen smelled of warm bread and something sweet he couldn't name. The sound of Maggie humming, a soft, tentative melody, drifted through the walls like a ghost coming home. She never sang lyrics, just the melody. But it was enough to ease the ache in his chest he'd grown used to ignoring. Even Shepherd had softened. The old German Shepherd, once a sentinel of silence, had become gentler around her, trailing Maggie with watchful eyes and lying near her feet whenever she stopped moving. Still, there were moments when the dog would stiffen, his ears twitching toward the tree line beyond the pastures, moments when the wind carried something foul. It was on one such evening, when the sun hung low over Bitterroot Valley and the hills glowed in orange fire, that Hank noticed it too. They were stacking chopped firewood near the barn when Shepherd suddenly rose from a crouch and let out a low, guttural growl. His hackles lifted like spiked fur beneath his collar. Hank dropped the log in his hand. "Shepherd," he warned. The dog didn't budge. Maggie froze, her eyes searching the ridgeline beyond the fence. "He's close," she whispered. Her voice trembled, and she wrapped her arms instinctively around herself. Hank didn't need to ask who. That night, after locking every window and double-checking the bolt on the back door, Hank sat quietly at the table. A shotgun leaned against the wall behind him. Shepherd lay with his head on his paws, but his eyes never shut. Maggie moved about the kitchen, slower than usual, pausing often to glance toward the window. When she finally spoke, it was barely a whisper. "He used to do this before he hit me, the watching, the following, like he wanted me to know I belonged to him, even when he wasn't near." Hank clenched his jaw. "He doesn't own you." "No," she said, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something different in her voice. "Steal, he never did." The next morning, Hank drove to the sheriff's office in Hamilton. Sheriff Dwayne Coulter was a large man with a thick neck and thinning blonde hair. His uniform slightly wrinkled, and his voice always one notch too relaxed. He'd known Hank for years, mostly from community events before Mary's death. "You sure it's him?" Dwayne asked, leaning on his cluttered desk. "I know what a man looks like when he's hunting." Hank replied, his voice cold. "He's out there, near my property, without hard evidence. We can't do much. No restraining order, no complaint on file. She can't risk filing one." Hank said he'd disappear before you ever caught him, then come back when no one's watching. Dwayne sighed. "I'll put a car nearby. Just keep your eyes open. Hank, back at the farm." Toby had come again. The boy had grown bolder with his visits, often sitting under the oak tree with his sketch pad, never speaking. Maggie liked him. She would wave and smile, sometimes placing cookies on the fence for him without saying a word. But on this day, Toby did something he had never done before. He spoke. Hank was walking past the field when the boy appeared at his side, holding a new drawing. It showed Shepherd standing between the house and a dark shadow, his teeth bared. In the shadow, faintly drawn, was a man's shape. Toby looked up at Hank and whispered, "Shepherd knows who's bad." Hank crouched beside him, stunned. "Say that again." Toby looked him straight in the eye. "He knows. He always knows." Then the boy turned and walked back toward the tree, leaving Hank frozen with the paper in his hand. Later that evening, Maggie found Hank sanding down a broken fence post. She stood in silence for a long moment before asking, "Did you always live like this? What do you mean, quiet, alone, with ghosts instead of people?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he handed her the drawing Toby had given him. She studied it, her breath catching. "Does it feel like your life's changing?" she asked, voice fragile. "Yes," Hank said, then, after a pause, "and it scares the hell out of me." They stood like that for a long time, with the light fading behind them, the wind rustling the dry grass in quiet approval. The sky above Bitterroot Ridge had darkened into a velvet blue, pricked with early starlight. The evening air was unseasonably warm for spring, heavy with the scent of damp earth and the faint metallic tang of pine sap. Inside the farmhouse, the lights were dim, and a quiet hum of peace had settled between the walls. Shepherd lay by the hearth, his breathing even but ears still twitching at every creak of wood. Maggie sat on the sofa, feeding her baby, her hair falling loose from a braid as she whispered soft lullabies, nonsense syllables that somehow soothed more than words ever could. Hank was at the kitchen sink, rinsing out a chipped mug. His eyes drifted now and then toward Maggie and the child, a look of something halfway between awe and disbelief in them. He would never say it aloud, not yet, but he'd grown used to their presence, used to the quiet warmth of Maggie's smile, the soft patter of the baby's feet against her shirt, the way her laughter, when it came, startled even herself. But peace is often loudest before it breaks. It started with a noise, a sharp, metallic creak that sliced through the stillness like a blade. Shepherd's head snapped up, his whole body tensing as he pushed to his feet. Hank froze, the mug slipping slightly in his hand. The sound had come from the barn, without a word. Hank dried his hands on a towel, crossed the room, and retrieved the shotgun from behind the door. Maggie looked up, eyes wide. "What is it?" she asked. "Stay inside," Hank said, his voice low. "Don't open the door unless it's me." Shepherd was already ahead of him, ears up, body low to the ground like a wolf ready to strike. They moved silently across the yard, boots crunching on gravel, wind brushing through the trees with a whisper. The barn's side door was ajar, swaying faintly in the breeze. The faint glow of the hanging lamp inside flickered as though nervous. Hank stepped forward, carefully, shotgun angled down but ready. Shepherd pressed close to his leg, growling low, just enough to tremble the earth beneath them. Then came the cry. It wasn't loud, a soft whimper. From the stall near the back, Hank's blood ran cold. He kicked the barn door open with one swift motion and burst inside, sweeping the flashlight beam across the room. And there, standing over a crate of old blankets, arms outstretched and face twisted in panic, was a man, thin, tall, his face unshaven, and eyes wild beneath the brim of a tattered baseball cap. Chase. He was wearing a dark hoodie, the sleeves pulled over scarred hands. His jeans were smeared with dust and grease. He looked both desperate and unhinged, like a man who had nothing left to lose and would do anything to reclaim control. "I'm taking them," he snarled, stepping closer to the crate. "She's not yours," Hank said, shotgun raised. "She's mine if I say so," Chase shouted, and that's when Shepard moved. In a flash, the dog lunged with a guttural bark that echoed through the barn. Chase stumbled back, barely raising his arms in time as Shepard tackled him to the ground. The man screamed, kicking wildly as the German Shepherd clamped his teeth just above the wrist, hard enough to pin him, not tear him apart. "Get him off! Get him off!" Chase shrieked, "Not yet." Hank growled, eyes blazing, "Not until the law sees what you are." He kept the shotgun aimed steadily as he pulled out his phone and dialed. His fingers were shaking. Not with fear, but with the adrenaline of something long buried being unearthed. Rage, protection, purpose within minutes. The red and blue lights of the sheriff's truck splashed across the barn walls. Dwayne Coulter emerged with a deputy, flashlight and cuffs in hand. He took one look at Chase's twisted body on the floor, Shepard still hovering inches above him, and gave a sharp nod. "I think we've seen enough," he said. They pulled Chase up, his wrists clamped in metal, his curses slurred and feral. Maggie appeared at the barn door, baby in her arms, eyes glistening, when she saw Chase being dragged out. Her knees buckled, and Hank caught her before she could fall. "It's over," he said. "No," she whispered, her face buried in his chest. "It's only beginning." The next day, the air was soft with morning haze, and the trees wore gold like robes. The silence around the farmhouse wasn't the tense kind, it was the kind after a storm, when even the birds wait for permission to sing again. Toby arrived early. He came without a word, as usual. But today he carried something carefully tucked beneath his arm, a sheet of thick paper. He didn't go to the tree. Instead, he walked straight up to Maggie, who sat in the rocking chair with the baby. He handed her the drawing. It showed 4 figures, Maggie holding her child, Hank with one hand on her shoulder, Shepard seated in front, and a bright, glowing sky above them. The colors radiated warmth, gold, orange, and soft pink. There were no shadows, no monsters, only peace. Maggie touched the page with trembling fingers. "Is this us?" Toby nodded, then softly, he said, "Family." She began to cry, not the frightened kind, but the kind that feels like rain after a long drought, and behind her. Hank stood at the door, watching with something unfamiliar softening his usually stone-set face. Something called hope. The last remnants of winter had surrendered completely now. By mid-April, the hills of Bitterroot Ridge were painted in soft green, and the old oak near the farmhouse had begun to leaf out, its branches heavy with promise. The air carried a different weight now, not the cold breath of grief or fear, but something lighter, the kind of air that comes when sorrow loosens its grip, even if it never leaves entirely, inside the farmhouse. The windows were open for the first time in months. Curtains fluttered gently, and the scent of blooming wildflowers wafted in from the fields. The house, once steeped in silence, and the scent of wood smoke and solitude, now pulsed with life. The baby cooed from his bassinet in the living room, and Maggie, humming softly, moved through the kitchen in a blue cotton dress that once belonged to Mary. It was loose around her small frame, but it suited her, gentle, simple, strong. Shepard lay at his usual spot near the door, his head on his paws, one ear always cocked. He had aged a little in the last few weeks, his muzzle a bit grayer. his movements slower, but there was still a fire in his eyes. The townspeople had begun calling him the Guardian of Two Worlds. The story of how he'd protected a child not born of his kind had spread quietly through the valley, carried on whispers and glances, like a modern-day folk tale. No one mocked it. Some believed it. Others didn't, but everyone respected it. Hank was on the porch, repairing a wicker chair with a piece of twine. The sleeves of his shirt were rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms tanned and marked by time. His once stern face was softer now, still weathered, still quiet, but the permanent furrow in his brow had eased. He'd found rhythm again, not in work, but in belonging. He glanced up when he heard footsteps across the yard. Toby was approaching. The boy had changed. Subtly but surely. His shoulders weren't so tense. His steps were more certain. He still didn't speak much, but when he did, it was with intention, and he smiled now, especially when Shepherd greeted him with a quiet bark and nuzzled his side, in one hand. Toby carried a worn leather-bound notebook. He'd started keeping it a week ago, at Grace's suggestion. Grace was a retired schoolteacher from town, silver-haired and straight-backed, known for her sharp tongue and her even sharper sense of who needed help. She had heard about what happened from Sheriff Coulter and taken it upon herself to stop by the farm once a week, bringing preserves and firm advice. Toby sat on the porch steps and opened the notebook, flipping past several sketches, Hank feeding the goats, Maggie in the kitchen, the baby asleep in a basket. He landed on a new one, Shepherd standing in a beam of light, the barn behind him and the forest far off. Above the dog's head was a faint glimmer, not quite a halo, not quite sunlight, something between the two. "You finished it?" Hank asked. Toby nodded and looked up. "He saved us all." The boy said it was only 4 words, but they carried the weight of a whole season of silence. Hank reached over and ruffled Toby's hair. Yes, he did. That afternoon, as the light filtered through the trees and the breeze swayed the wild grass, they gathered under the oak. Maggie spread out a blanket while Shepherd lay down with a soft groan. The baby squirmed in her arms, making curious little noises as Hank took a seat beside them. Toby leaned against the trunk, his notebook still open on his lap. Maggie looked over at Hank, sunlight catching in her eyes. "Did you ever think this would be your life?" Hank laughed, low and quiet. "No, I thought my story had already ended." Shepherd let out a soft huff and pressed his head into Hank's thigh. As if to remind him otherwise, Hank looked around, the oak swaying above them. Maggie laughing softly as the baby tugged at her fingers. Toby scribbling shapes into the corner of his page. Shepherd watching it all with regal stillness. He reached out and gently scratched the dog behind the ears. "I thought life had closed its doors on me," Hank said, voice rough. "But this dog, he led me back to something I thought was gone, a miracle. I guess." Maggie reached for his hand. Their fingers intertwined, not in drama or declaration, but in quiet, certain understanding, and under the branches of the old oak, with the sun sliding through the leaves and light pooling gently at their feet. The house on Bitterroot Ridge stopped being just a shelter. It became home, sometimes. Miracles don't come with trumpets or angels in the sky. Sometimes. They arrive quietly on 4 legs with a steady gaze and a heart full of loyalty. This story reminds us that God often sends help not in the form we expect, but in the one we need most. Through a wounded dog, a broken man, and a brave young mother, He brought healing, protection, and family back to a place once filled with silence in our daily lives. We may miss these quiet miracles, a kind word, an open door, a loyal friend, but they are there, waiting for us to see them, like Hank did. We only need to be willing to open our hearts again. If this story touched your soul, take a moment to thank God for the unseen blessings in your life. Comment Amen if you believe that He still works through small signs and quiet heroes. Share this video to bless someone who may need hope today. And don't forget to subscribe so we can continue spreading stories that remind the world. Love, faith, and second chances are real. May God bless you and your family.